Just sit down in it. Just sit down in that seat. My name is Joel. I'm a pastor on staff here, and it's such an honor for me to continue on in our series, Standing Strong. Pastor Brian is off on vacation in Boston, missing all of you, so he says hello. But we are in our third week of Standing Strong, Risk Takers of the Bible. If you haven't been here, the first week, Pastor Brian talked about Abraham. Last week, we talked about Joseph and that incredible ability to stand strong and forgive in difficult circumstances. And today, we're going to be talking about Hannah. You may be familiar with Hannah. She's a person in the Bible that we're going to talk about today that stood strong. This message, I will say, it was difficult to prepare. Hannah's, I'll just tell you, her strength is humble dependence on God. It's incredible, her ability to just lean in regardless of the circumstances. So now you know everything I'm going to talk about. But for me, I'm teaching, I just want you to know up front, I'm teaching from an area of deficiency. These are not my strengths that I'm like, oh, this is something God has mastered in my life, humble dependence. It's kind of the opposite. So I'm with you. You know, we're just going to learn about what God wants to do today through Hannah. For me, independence was taught as maybe the most important character quality. Not just my home, but in culture. You know, as we were doing this topic, I was looking at, where's that verse that says, fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, independence. I never found it. I didn't find it. But I just always believed dependence was weakness. Needing other people was weakness. Group projects in school and in work were the worst, right? That was just the general belief. I was when I was a teenager, I actually came to this church in junior high and high school, and we used to do these concerts every April. We'd have Christian bands from all over come in, and every weekend in April we'd have this concert series called April Fest. And because of my huge stature, I was a security guard when I was 17 years old. At those, people were laughing. It's okay. But it was pretty fun. We'd have hundreds of students stuck in the basement here. Has anybody ever heard of the band MXPX? Heard of them? Their first show in California was in our basement. So how about that? Now you know a little MHC tidbit right there. And the Supertones, a lot of the guys are from here. Their first show as the Supertones was in our basement. So, and my little band, I can't remember, 15? My little band was their opening band. So how about that? I didn't have to work security that night. So that is not in the notes, but thank you for the applause. It's significantly more than I got that night. So I appreciate that. Anyway, I was working security, and you might think, oh, why do you need security at a Christian teenage show? We had people show up with knives. We had people spray pepper spray into the crowd. We had all kinds of crazy stuff. Because there'd be tons of believing and unbelieving students here, and they would hear about the good news of Christ through music and stuff. But as a security guard, I got very significant training. I got a T-shirt, right, that said security on it. And then this was my training. I wish I was exaggerating. They said, if somebody seems violent or unruly, just walk over. Because we would have a mosh pit. You guys know about mosh pits? Where people are just running in a circle, bashing into each other. That's what you do. There was no floating. We didn't want to be dangerous. No spinal injuries. So everything was just physical violence down low, nothing up high. So if somebody got out of control, what I was supposed to do is walk over, put my hand on their shoulder in the middle of the mosh pit, just break in and say, hey, bro, calm down, or you're going to have to leave. That was my training. Put your hand on a violent person and say, hey, bro, calm down. Why don't you try? I'm going to train you guys. Turn to somebody near you, put your hand on their shoulder, and say, hey, bro, calm down, or you're going to have to leave. Right? Don't you think that would diffuse virtually any situation? I mean, pretty much every situation. So anyway, there was a concert going on. This is getting long, so sorry. So here we are, we're having a concert. There was an infamous guy in the local scene, the local Christian music scene. He was like 6'5", probably 3 bills. I mean, a big guy. And he almost always wore a green shirt. So me and one of my friends saw him at these shows, and we call him Jolly Green, like Jolly Green Giant. So Jolly Green came to our concert. I'm sorry if you're here, Jolly Green, and you're like an older guy now. It's just whatever. But Jolly Green could be violent, and he was huge. And this night, Jolly Green had a cast on his arm. And we have kids that are like 12, 13, up to people that are super old, like 32, 33, all down there. Music's going, mosh pit's going counterclockwise this time. It's NASCAR day, so everybody's going counterclockwise. And Jolly Green decides, he's going to change the direction. So you see him crouch down, you're like, what's going on? Crouch, boom! And just kids just fall all over the ground. So I had a choice. I could step in and handle this myself, like a man. Or I could go get my team. I had 2 friends that were on security that night. One of them is 6'3", at that time, probably 280. One of them is 5'9", at that time, probably 280. And Mark can confirm, right? I have a friend that was there. He knows that we had a friend that was 5'9", 280. That was on security. But I didn't need those guys. I'm independent. So I use my training. I march over to Jolly Green and put my hand on his shoulder. Hey, bro, calm. Boom! He hit me in the face with his cast. Boom! Right in the face. But I'm independent, right? So I just ran. I just ran away. No, I went and got my friends. Eventually, I came to my senses. I stopped seeing stars, and I got my friends, and Jolly Green got escorted away. But as I sat down with a bag of ice on my mouth, I began to have the beginnings of a belief that the kind of independence that I valued actually came from a place of insecurity and not a place of wisdom. Right? And Hannah, it's not a long stretch. Hannah, in the story that we're going to see, just avoided all of that stuff where she's like, I can do everything myself. She depended on God. And if I could bring myself to that place in daily life where I'm faced with difficulty, and my first place I go isn't getting hit in the mouth, but going to God first, depending on Him first, I'd be in a much better place. In our story today, Hannah, she's going to experience some great pain, but she knew where to go to find help. This story is pretty unique, just because the content is very familiar, unfortunately, but it's familiar. A lot of stories we read in the Bible, they seem so far off when you're talking about parting a Red Sea, or you're talking about building a big boat that all the animals in the world are going to go on, or you're talking about fighting a giant. I haven't done any of those things. I guess I almost fought a giant. But in this story, Hannah is experiencing real pain that communicates to exactly what people go through, whether they experience the same pain or something similar. It's not this long stretch of something that we can't understand. We've all experienced pain. So before we get into Hannah's story, her story is in 1 Samuel chapter 1. After her kind of part of the story is over, she sings this beautiful song in chapter 2 as a prayer. And we're going to start there so that we start to understand, before we get into the specifics of the story, we start to understand what did Hannah believe about God? As she was going through these events, what was in her mind? What did she know to be true? So we're going to start in chapter 2, and we can clearly see what she believed that helped her stand strong in her pain, and then we'll go back to chapter 1 and see how these things helped her out. So if you have your Bible or a phone or something, you can turn to 1 Samuel chapter 2. We're going to look through the first 10 verses. It says, Then Hannah prayed, My heart rejoices in the Lord. The Lord has made me strong. As we see, she's going to make some important choices, but she doesn't see it as she did it by herself. I'm independent. Right away, the Lord has made me strong. Now I have an answer for my enemies. I rejoice because you rescued me. She's dependent on the Lord. No one is holy like the Lord. There is no one besides you. There is no rock like our God. So we kind of see this first thing that she believes about God is that God is a strong foundation. He is the place to stand. There's no one else, she said, right? There's no one else. But when you're looking for a place to be, being close to God, dependent on God, is the place. Then she goes on, verse 3, "Stop acting so proud and haughty. Don't speak with such arrogance. For the Lord is a God who knows what you have done. He will judge your actions. The bow of the mighty is now broken, and those who stumbled are now strong. Those who were well-fed are now starving, and those who were starving are now full. The childless woman now has 7 children, and the woman with many children wastes away. The Lord gives both death and life. He brings some down to the grave, but raises others up. The Lord makes some poor and others rich. He brings some down and lifts others up. He lifts the poor from the dust and the needy from the garbage dump. He sets them among princes, placing them in seats of honor. For all the earth is the Lord's, and He has set the world in order." So 2 things we see in there that she believed. She believed that God possesses the power to change circumstances. Right? He's the one who lifts the poor. He's the one who breaks the bow of the mighty. He can do whatever He wants. He's all powerful. And so if you're going to go somewhere with your pain, why not go to a place where you know where you're going, God has the chance to change things. It's a smart place to be. But I think it's not in the written notes, but it'll be on the screen. You also see in this last passage that God has a huge heart to lift the broken. You know, we see that He's taking the poor. He's seating them among the princes. He's raising them up. And it's not only in Hannah's song that we see this to be true. Throughout Scripture, we see God regularly seating Himself with the poor. In the life of Jesus, we see that God the Father describes Himself that way in Isaiah, that He exists in a high and holy place and also with those who are poor and destitute to raise them up. I mean, this is the heart of God. The heart of God is to see people that are broken, to see people that are humble, and to be there to raise them up for their good and for His glory, right? It's just a very common thing that happens. And Hannah knew that God does that stuff. He will protect His faithful ones, it says in verse 9. But the wicked will disappear in darkness. Then she says, I love this line, "No one will succeed by strength alone," Joel. It's only in my version. No one will succeed by strength alone. You may believe yourself to be the smartest, fastest, strongest person, but apart from God, we cannot achieve the things of God. We can't succeed in this world without God. Something that I find interesting, I'm accentuating He has a huge heart to lift the broken. And it sounds like I'm ignoring that He also destroys the proud, right? Why does He do that? Is He just mad at them? I don't think so. I would think that He breaks the bow of the mighty. He opposes the proud because He knows that from that space, they're not going to find what they need. If it really is something that historically we've used as an excuse for why ministry is difficult in Orange County. People believe that they have all of the answers that they need. When you're in a different location where people need shelter and they need food and they want for things, they see themselves already in a place of dependence. And so then that idea of, oh wow, God could be the source for everything. God could be the source of my sustenance. Physically, He could be the source of my salvation, my forgiven sins. It seems to make sense easier for people. But when you're in a place where people feel like, I want for nothing, I need nothing, I certainly don't need a God to start telling me what to do. I'm doing fine on my own. It's a difficult place. And so I think out of love, God often brings those people down, and He's not putting them down and holding them down forever. We see story after story, people like the Apostle Paul, who God took from a place of respect and honor and all these things, and God broke him, took away his sight, made him dependent, right? The first thing He did was made him dependent on other people. and he revealed himself to him, and then God was able to use him from that place. So I think that's also in God's heart. It's not spelled out as clearly, but you don't succeed without God. It doesn't happen. Verse 10, those who fight against the Lord will be shattered. He thunders against them from heaven. The Lord judges throughout the earth. He gives power to his king. He increases the strength of his anointed one. That's an interesting verse. If you think about the timing, Israel hadn't had a king yet. So it could sound weird when Hannah's singing, he gives power to his king. He increases the strength of his anointed one. At that time, if they're talking about the anointed one, they are looking forward to the one that's coming that's going to be a blessing to all nations. Like, she's probably talking about the Messiah, because a king didn't exist yet. Although, fun fact, her son will anoint the first king. That was for free. Okay, so let's go back. These 4 things that we've learned about Hannah that she believed about God. God is a strong foundation. God possesses the power to change circumstances. God has a huge heart to lift the broken, and no one succeeds without God. Isn't that a pretty strong case for dependence on God? Yes, Joel. Yeah, you're right, guys. It's a very strong case. So now let's look at her story and kind of how some of these things worked into her dependence. Hannah's story starts with pain. God introduces her to us, and then right away in the scriptures, we're just told about her difficulty. Starting in 1 Samuel 1, we'll start in verse 2. Elkanah had 2 wives, Hannah and Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah did not. Each year, Elkanah would travel to Shiloh to worship and sacrifice to the Lord of heaven's armies at the tabernacle. The priests of the Lord at that time were 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas. On the days Elkanah presented his sacrifice, he would give portions of the meat to Peninnah and each of her children, right, his wife that had kids. And though he loved Hannah, he would give her only one choice portion because the Lord had given her no children. So Peninnah would taunt Hannah and make fun of her because the Lord had kept her from having children. This is the beginning of her pain, is that she's kind of co-wife with this other person who has children. She doesn't. There are so many people. I mean, if you've been on earth long enough, either you or someone you know really well has struggled with infertility and the pain of that desire and chasing and nothing happening. And so that is dreadful pain enough. Now imagine if you have somebody that you live with who's supposed to be close to you, who is constantly berating you, constantly pointing out God doesn't want you to have a kid. I can't imagine enduring the cruelty that Hannah had to deal with. Then in verse 7, it says, year after year, right? This wasn't just a couple months in the life of Hannah. Year after year, it was the same. Peninnah would taunt Hannah as they went to the tabernacle. Each time, Hannah would be reduced to tears and would not even eat. Verse 8, why are you crying, Hannah? Elkanah would ask. Why aren't you eating? Why be downhearted just because you have no children? You have me. Isn't that better than having 10 sons? This is not a passage on marriage, right? It's not prescriptive in how husbands should behave. I don't know what it's like to be married to 2 women at the same time, but I would think even in that case, this is bad. This is a bad approach, right? But it does show us another layer of Hannah's struggle. She's experiencing sorrow from a few things. From her desire to have a child, from someone close to her taunting her, preying on her most sensitive sorrow, and then being misunderstood, right? She's in sorrow, she's not eating, and then to have her husband, who does love her, it says, just being like, come on, get over it. Look how great I am, right? You've got me. It's a lot. It's a lot to take on. But there's something really I find unique about this story is Hannah has all this pain. But did you notice none of it is directly cited to to happen because she was standing up for the name of God, or because something happened and she was protecting. She was just in pain. She's a human that follows God, that loves God, that's experiencing pain. And I think it's awesome that God chose to include this in the scriptures, because we don't always see in everything that we suffer, oh, I stood up directly for my faith in this way, and that's why I'm experiencing pain. God also cares about just the human pain that we suffer. He cares about your relational pain. That has nothing to do with you standing up for or not standing up for Him. God cares about every part of your life. And He wants us to know how to respond in these moments when we're experiencing deep sorrow, anguish, these things that Hannah was experiencing. It's real human pain that we can relate to in some manner, right? Maybe you haven't dealt with infertility closely, but you've dealt with personal difficulty, trauma, pain, things that you're just like, why? Why is this happening? Why is this happening to me? But it's still important enough to take up a couple chapters of the Bible, and if you keep reading past where we're going to go today, you actually see how God uses this situation incredibly, incredibly for His glory. So we see Hannah's pain. The next thing we're going to see in 1 Samuel is Hannah's solution, her solution to the pain. In verse 10, it says, Hannah was in deep anguish, crying bitterly as she prayed to the Lord, and she made this vow. O Lord of heaven's army, if you will look upon my sorrow and answer my prayer and give me a son, then I will give him back to you. He will be yours for his entire lifetime. And as a sign that he has been dedicated to the Lord, his hair will never be cut. Hannah was living a tormented life. But instead of leaning away from God, she leaned in. She thought to herself, what do I know to be true of God? He's the rock like no other. He can change circumstances. He does look out for the lowly. These are all important things for me to know. I can't succeed without Him. So instead of running, I'm going to just go at Him. I'm not going to hide. She wasn't hiding her sorrow. She wasn't pretending like, oh, it's fine. You know, she was in anguish. She's in pain. It says that she's bitter, and in her bitterness, she just goes straight to God. It could seem like a risk. You know, sometimes going to the creator of the universe while we're kind of angry at Him could seem like a risk. You know, we're talking about great risk takers, but really, I mean, what would be a greater risk? Going to the one who has all the power, the ability to change, that loves the brokenhearted, or would it be a greater risk to just try to do it yourself and just internalize, just take it in, not share, not talk to your husband who's really helpful about it, you know? But that's the greater risk, is to take it on. But she chose to lean in. I think in my life, when I've had difficulty, there are lots of times where I haven't gone to God because I feel like this isn't that big a deal. You know, God has to deal with the salvation of humanity. God has to deal with, the world and all these, Satan. He's got a lot on His plate. He doesn't need like my anxiety, my worries. But I love this story because it illustrates something that Peter says much later on in the Bible. In 1 Peter 5:7, Peter says, give all your worries and cares to God, for He cares about you. God wants all of it. He doesn't want you to carry your burden by yourself at all. Jesus said His yoke is easy, His burden is light. He's trying to take weight off of your life. And God is doing it. He wants you to come to Him, not just so that He can stand there and tell you how great He is, but He cares. He cares for you. The same way that you would hope anybody that's near and dear to you, could you imagine if someone that's very close to you, a sibling, a parent, a spouse, a child, whoever it is, if they're in deep torment and they just stay away from you because they think you just don't care that much, that it's beneath you, you'd long for them to come to you. And God is the same way as our Father. He can handle it. He can handle and wants to handle all of our worries and cares. I need this message. pain and worry are real, and God cares. He wants us to lean into him. I want to take a quick aside, even though we're going to get to the end of Hannah's story, but before we do, Hannah's story, I'll just spoil it. Hannah's story ends in like a nice, tidy bow. She gets a child. He turns out to be like one of the greatest men God's ever made. It's awesome. She follows through. She comes and gives him coats every year when she sees him at the temple. It's really great. But, as you know, and I know, neat and tidy is not always the case. And so I don't want to rush through this story without addressing life can be hard, and we can do exactly what Hannah did. We can believe exactly what Hannah believed and not have all of the situation turn out exactly as we desire. But it doesn't mean that these things aren't true of God. It doesn't mean that being a rock, that he's the rock to go to. When I was young, I was 8 years old, my mom got really sick. And she had breast cancer, and so the family got around, we prayed, and she went into remission. I was 8, I was a new believer, and was like, this is unreal. God is the real deal. I placed my trust in God. My mom got sick, and then she got healed. Unreal. Then, probably a little more than about a year later, it came back, hardcore. And she died, a few months after that. And for me, I've had 30 years, right, of like, God, I did the same thing. Like, when she got re-sick, all the same people came around and did all the same stuff. We prayed, and it didn't work. And so I had to, at age 9, start to deal with like, who is God? Does he love me? Does he care about me? Does he answer prayer? Does he listen? And I'll tell you, eventually I came to a place where I believe he does. He does care. He does listen. But it doesn't always end up neat and tidy. The story of Hannah is amazing, but it's not normative. It's not like, oh yeah, this is exactly how it always goes. Sometimes God allows us to experience great suffering and loss and pain, and it doesn't work out clean. But he still is the God who wants all of our cares on him. He still is the God who's a foundation. He still is the God who wants to raise the brokenhearted. And so I just want to share, just before we move on, just a few things that for me over the years, I know people have experienced horrible things. I just felt like God really calling me to just share some things that have been a comfort to me when I feel like God didn't do what I asked him to do, even though I prayed in faith, even though my mom prayed in faith, even though my dad and my family and my church, we prayed in faith and God didn't heal the way I wanted. A couple things that have been a comfort to me. One is shooting basketballs. It may not seem spiritual. It's just a suggestion. I could go find an empty court somewhere. I could shoot. I could cry. I could pray. I could yell at God. And people don't think you're weird because I'm like wiping my face, but it's like sweat, right? I'm like sweating. I'm like grimacing, an ugly face, and they're like, oh, he's working hard. He's a hustler, right? Not going to go try to play that guy, for years, I would just shoot and pray and just ask God, like, do you care? Do you care about me? He would always find ways to show me his love. Excuse me. So that's one thing. It's not that important, but it helped me. And it helped when I got to high school. I could shoot three-pointers really well. So another thing that helped comfort me is knowing that Everyone dies. I used to always say that. Everyone dies, right? I used to quote this statistic to people. Every person in 1689 who drank orange juice eventually died, right? Everybody who didn't drink orange juice in 1689 eventually died. Everybody eventually dies. It's a course of life. But what I came to realize is that everyone dies because God loves us. Go home later today, not right now, later today, go home, read through Genesis 3 when Adam and Eve fall. And when God kicks them out of the garden, I for the longest time, just saw it as punitive. Like, I made a beautiful place, you're not allowed to be in that beautiful place anymore. But as you read God's reasoning that he shows in chapter 3, there may have been some of that, but the big push to get them out of the garden was that he wanted to make sure that they could not live forever in a rebellious state, right? We know that they were full of shame of themselves. They were full of guilt. They were rebelling against him. And so this is what God says. In chapter 3, he says, God asked the question, what if they, right, they've already fallen, what if they reach out, take fruit from the tree of life and eat it? Then they will live forever. So the Lord banished them from the garden. He was trying to keep them away from the tree of life in a state that was less than what he desired for them. And it's the same for us. Death happens because God's desire is that we would not live forever in this state of brokenness. Do you think our world is broken? God doesn't want this to be our eternal situation. He allows death to happen so that he can create something new and fresh. He wants us to be renewed, forgiven, have our guilt taken away. Can you imagine a life free of guilt and shame forever? That's what God wants for you. And not just as citizens of heaven, but as adopted sons and daughters. That's the life he envisions. And I'll show you in Revelation 22, it says this. So this is after everything is done. God's people are with him. This is the picture that God gives to John. Then the angel showed me a river with the water of life, clear as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb. It flowed down the center of the main street. And then look what's there. On each side of the river grew a tree of life, bearing 12 crops of fruit with a fresh crop each month. The leaves were used for medicine to heal the nations. No longer will there be a curse upon anything, for the throne of God and of the Lamb will be there, and his servants will worship him, and they will see his face, and his name will be written on their foreheads. Which eternal existence would you choose for yourself? Would you choose to have this existence with broken relationship with God, damaged relationships with other people, with sin, shame, guilt, or the one that's renewed, where you're adopted, perfected, glorified? God has such a high vision of what he wants for you. And it's way more than this. And so he allows death for everyone eventually. It's hard. It's tragic. It hurts us, but God has something much better planned. Something else that's brought me comfort is just reading more about the life of Jesus. You know, Jesus, when he walked on the earth, he also experienced loss of loved ones. Some people believe that if they have more faith, they're better prayers, that God will do whatever they want. But you think about Jesus. Did Jesus have faith? Was Jesus a good prayer? I think Jesus was a good prayer. But he lost his father. We see Jesus on earth as a 12-year-old, right? Joseph and Mary are there, and Jesus is lost, and he's at the temple. They find him, right? Fast forward 18 years, age 30, Jesus is starting his public ministry. Where's Joseph? He's gone. Well, maybe they just don't write about him. What about when Jesus is on the cross, and he has to say to John, "Look out for my mother"? His father was gone. Do you think that Jesus had enough faith to save his father? He raised other people from the dead. He raised a little girl from the dead. He raised Lazarus from the dead. But he allowed his own father to die, knowing the grief that it would cost his mother, his siblings, himself. And I don't know why, for some reason, that it just brings me comfort that Jesus was a real human who dealt with real loss and real pain. And he doesn't want us all to live forever in this state. But enough about me and my experience, but those are some things that help me. I just wanted to get that out there because maybe you're dealing with major pain. Maybe some of it is irreversible. You're like, I already prayed. It's already passed. It doesn't mean that God doesn't love you desperately. Maybe you're experiencing pain and it looks like there's no hope. There is hope. Don't get me wrong. If you're in major pain and it looks like there's no light at the end of the tunnel, there is. God can do anything he wants to. Anything. His power is limitless. His love is enormous. And so ask. Be like Hannah. Go. Ask in faith, believing that God is the place to stand. He's the only place. And he can do it. He's the God who takes dry bones and breathes life and flesh and everything onto them. So I don't want to be misunderstood. I don't want to be Debbie Downer of Hannah's story. But both are true, right? Both are true. Okay, moving forward. Hannah's son, she was in anguish. She cried out to God to give her a son, and we see that God remembers Hannah. In verse 19, the entire family got up early the next morning and went to worship the Lord once more. They returned home to Ramah. When Elkanah slept with Hannah, the Lord remembered her plea. God remembered. This woman cried out to me in faith. She spoke in anguish with bitterness to God, but he was listening. He's listening. He hears you. He remembers you. Then the next thing we see is that Hannah remembers God. In verse 20, in due time she gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel, for she said, I asked the Lord for him. Samuel means God has heard. She never wanted to forget every time she said her son's name. She never wanted to forget that this was a gift of God, direct answer to her prayers. She wanted to remember God. Verse 24, when the child was weaned, Hannah took him to the tabernacle in Shiloh. What a turn. Think of how many times she went to that tabernacle, unable to eat in sorrow, and now she's coming with the God has heard answer to prayer. They brought along a 3-year-old bull for the sacrifice and a basket of flour and some wine. After sacrificing the bull, they brought the boy to Eli. Sir, do you remember me? Hannah asked. We didn't read through it just because of time, but you can go back. When Hannah was crying out, Eli was there, priest that was there, and she was crying out so uncontrollably, he said, don't come here drunk ever again. And she said, she's not drunk, and then they prayed together, and then, this is great, look what happened. Hannah, so do you remember me? Hannah asked, I am the very woman who stood here several years ago praying to the Lord. I asked the Lord to give me this boy, and he has granted my request. Now I am giving him to the Lord, and he will belong to the Lord his whole life. And they worshiped the Lord there. Hannah, in the midst of her pain, stood strong by depending on God. God had the power to change her circumstances, and he did. Then she gave God the glory and was somehow, in this circumstance, able to hold her treasure so loosely and allow these years of pain waiting for this child, and she still was able to follow through and let him go. And she got to see him every year. You can read on. They're not like separated forever, but she followed her vow to God. I can't imagine that risk. It's right. We can say, "Oh, it's not that much of a risk. God is all powerful. God, all these. He's the foundation." But to just take this child and say, yes, God, I'll do what I told you I'm going to do. I mean, my kids, this is just like a life lesson I could learn from Hannah, right? Just to release the things that I think I somehow am keeping safe. Somehow I think my strength is going to achieve something. We already know it's not. I can't achieve anything. I won't succeed on my own strength. I have to release my treasures, my children, my relationships, my life, my job, whatever it is. I have to hold it loosely the way Hannah showed us and risk. God might not do with those things what I want. But do you think that her son Samuel was safer with her following the vow? Was he safer at the tabernacle following with a mom that's following God? Or would he have been safer with her in rebellion to God, not doing what she said she was going to do? I think she made the right choice, and God used it for his glory. I can loosen my grip on things, the things I care about. In reality, God cares about those things even more than I do, and he has real power to protect and use them for his glory. God is more powerful than we could ever imagine. God is more powerful than my two large friends with large stature, right? God's more powerful than the Jolly Green Giant. He can do whatever he wants. He can protect anyone. He can use them for his glory. The band's going to come up, and as they do, I just want to ask some questions. You can close your eyes if you'd like, and just spend a few moments with God, asking him these questions, or asking yourself these questions in his presence. Where do you take your pain? Where do you go with it? Where should you take it? What would that look like? What would it look like for you to take your pain to God? Are you trying to succeed by strength alone? What are you facing right now that you just know is you got to make it happen? You're going to force it to happen, and you need to release it to God. Do you remember God? Do you account the blessings that you have to him so that you can be free with him? For Hannah, it was really easy. Samuel was obviously from God. She prayed. It was miraculous. She had this child. For you, how do you know? How do you know if what you have is from God? I'll tell you, it is. James tells us every good and perfect gift comes down from the Father of lights. Remember that God is the source. He's the source of all you have that is good. What if God doesn't provide the way you hoped? Will you still continue to believe that he is the foundation, that he's all-powerful, that he lifts the brokenhearted? Where do you need hope today? What pain are you sitting in and you're just saying to yourself, I don't see a way out? Take all of these things and just lay them before God. He wants to carry your burden. And as you have that conversation and hold all that, we're going to sing together, God is able, and just know that whatever you're struggling with, wherever you are, wherever you've been, God is able. He's able to accomplish whatever needs to be done. So let's trust in him as we sing to him.